there, 6th grade history students. We're back in chapter 11 with the Mesoamerican civilizations, and today we're going to be talking about the Mayans. Now the Mayans take up a big chunk of this chapter, and we're going to split them into two videos. Today's video is going to cover page 159 in your workbook, and it's going to cover the section 2, section 3, section 4, and section 5 and section 6, then I'm also on page 161. So 159 and 161, sections 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The Mayans are an absolutely fascinating group of people, and I know you guys are all like, Mrs. Hanson, you think all history is fascinating. And, well, that's because it is. But I think the Mayans are really cool, and I think you're going to think that too when we're finished. The Mayan civilization is really interesting because archaeologists have found traces of the Mayan civilization that date as far back as the Olmecs, which is, I think, really cool. So this is a very old, very long-lasting civilization. They were villages, houses, lots of fields. Some villages had public buildings. Usually these are for religious purposes, sometimes for governmental purposes, sometimes both. As in many societies, the rulers were also the priests in the Mayan society. But let me not get ahead of myself. We'll get there. Really cool picture on 296 in your book is the Plaza of Tikal. So let's talk about the Mayans. For around 2,500 years, the Mayans built their homes in the rainforests and high plateaus in Central America. They also settled in the lowlands, and one of the reasons they did this was because they could get fresh water from very deep sinkholes, kind of similar to wells, but not quite the same thing. These sinkholes were called cenotes, which is kind of an interesting way to pronounce something that if you're looking at it, you might think it's, oops, sorry, got that backwards. It looks like C notes, but it's cenotes. As the Mayan civilization grew and prospered, obviously their population increased, their villages grew larger, and over time, by about AD 250, the Mayans were the dominant group of people in the area. They dominated the region, they built city-states, and as I said before, one of the largest, and as our book calls it, most magnificent city-states was called Tikal. You can see a picture of the ruins of the Plaza of Tikal, which is really, really cool. Tikal is in the Guatemalan rainforest. You could get out a map and you can find Guatemala. In fact, if you go back to page 292 in your book, you can find Guatemala. It's kind of right there in the center of Central America, full of rainforests, a beautiful country. The city of Tikal, its buildings, and its population covered around 47 square miles. So this was a big city. And at its height, the population was at least 60,000. Now, we don't think, oh, that's not that big of a city, but back then, this was huge. The Mayans were a very, what you would call advanced civilization. Between 250 and 900 AD, the Mayans made a lot of advances in all kinds of area. Art, architecture, literature. They wrote hundreds of books, thousands of sculptures. They constructed these huge palaces, these huge pyramids. They built irrigation systems. They were a very advanced civilization. They studied the stars. Astronomy was very important to the Maya civilization, just like it was to all of the other civilizations that we've studied. They composed music, they wrote songs, they had played all kinds of games. In fact, we'll talk a little bit more about some of that in a little bit. They also traded. So within their own cities and towns, they traded with each other, and they also traded with groups of people outside the Mayan civilization. In the mid-1500s, there was a Spanish priest named Diego de Landa who came with the conquistadores and tried to convert the Mayas to Roman Catholicism. When the Mayas refused to accept this religion, de Landa was not a nice dude, and he was kind of awful, actually, and he had them tortured. They were stretched on pulleys, burned with candles, tortured in all kinds of different ways. De Landa had a whole library of Mayan literature burned because he said, and this is a quote from De Landa, since they contain nothing but superstitions and falsehoods of the devil. I can kind of see his point, but I'm also like, oh, all the history that's been destroyed. It's kind of interesting, though. De Landa seemed to have had a little bit of a change of heart because he realized that converting the Mayas would be easier if he actually understood them, if he knew who they were and understood their culture. And so he became a student of the Mayas. Some of the things that he did was he tried to translate their symbolic writing into Spanish. So the Mayas had writing similar to hieroglyphics, kind of, pictographs. He tried to translate that into Spanish, and a lot of what we know today about the Mayan culture in the 1500s, we know because of the writings of Diego de Landa. The rest of what we know about Mayan culture and about their ancestors comes from, of course, archaeology, from the stones and the artifacts in the Mayan lands. There are Mayan descendants still living, still around in Guatemala and the surrounding areas. Not all of them intermarried and intermingled with the Spanish, and so there are still Mayan people that play the music of their ancestors. They play the ball games. In fact, there were several videos. If you go and you can look up other videos on YouTube, be careful when you do that. But there were actually a couple that I saw that there are ball leagues now that still play this this Mesoamerican ball game, which is really cool. Some of the ball courts, some of the irrigation systems, some of the roads, you can still see, you can still use. Well, they don't really use them, but you can tour them. And it's really cool and a testament, I think, to how well they built these things. Many of the buildings and statues are in ruin, and almost all the Mayan books are gone. And with them, a lot of the information about how the Mayas lived was gone as well. One of the things, well, let's talk about math and astronomy, because the Mayas made a lot of progress in this area. In fact, you got a 0 in your telephone number or in your street address? You ever tried to do math without zeros? The ancient Mayas were some of the first people to develop the idea of zero, the concept of zero. I think it's really interesting how a lot of these ancient civilizations that are so separate from each other were all able to come up with the idea of zero. I think that's really cool and really interesting, and I think God's done a lot of neat things there. The Mayas were able to do really complicated calculations once they had the concept of zero. They were able to keep detailed records. It's very interesting to me that the Mayan math system was based on the number 20. Ours is base 10. Theirs was based on number 20. They made calendars very similar to the calendars of the Olmecs. The Mayan calendar was based on the cycles of the moon and the sun. Their solar year actually had the same number of days as ours. And they made these calendars after observing the stars and the planets and the sun and the moon as they moved through the sky. It looks like they moved through the sky, right? Their observations were so accurate that the Mayans were able to figure out the planets orbits of the planets. They could predict solar eclipses. They were really just on the ball. On 298 in your book, there's a really cool picture of a Mayan codex. Mayan books were in a format known as the codex, and this is the accordion, an accordion style book. So it's a little bit like a scroll, except instead of rolling it up, the pages are folded and they come out like an accordion. In fact, when we're done with our Chapter 11 organizer, if you follow the instructions, you'll be able to put your organizer together in the format of a codex if you want to do that. Now, section 3 on page 159 in your workbook, in your SAM, and then we're on 299 in your book. The Mayan people. Let's talk about some interesting things about how the Mayans looked and dressed, and some things about their social classes. One of the things that historians can understand from Mayan sculpture is how the ancient Mayans looked. We also have some descriptions from, of course, Diego de Landa. According to him, the Mayan people were around 5 feet tall. They had very dark hair, very thick dark hair. The men, in fact, if you look on 299, you can see a picture of what a Mayan man might have looked like. The men wore their hair long, and they would braid it, and it would be braided around the tops of their heads with a braid going down their back. Women wore braids as well. Usually they would, be braided and then coiled around their heads and tied with ribbons. The Mayan people appeared to have preferred noses that were long and sloping foreheads. Some of them would use a clay to create, they would pack clay to create a ridge from their forehead down to their nose so that it looked like it was all one slope. This was a true sign of beauty. A true sign of beauty. They believed the sloping forehead was just the height of gorgeousness. And one of the things that they did to form that early in life was that a newborn's skull is a little bit softer, and so they would bind a board to the newborn's forehead until the soft bones got hard, and so they would basically kind of force the newborn's foreheads to be in that sloped shape. Also, interestingly enough, there is some evidence that the Maya people preferred crossed eyes, which I think is interesting. It may have something to do with the fact that one of their gods was supposedly cross-eyed. And so the way they did this was parents would put a bead, they would hang a bead right here between a baby's eyes, and as the baby's trying to track and learn how to look at things, the baby's eyes would sort of naturally cross to look at that bead, and that is how they would create having crossed eyes in their babies. As Mayans would get older, they would do other things for their appearance. They tattooed symbols on their arms and their legs. Most young men would shave their heads above their forehead to show off their slanted head. Many men had their ears pierced. Now, this is something that you might find interesting because you'll see a lot more of this nowadays, is they would have their ears pierced, and then they would put plugs in the holes in their ears. They would slice holes in their earlobes, and they would add plugs, and they would add bigger and bigger and bigger plugs. And we see this often in certain cultures in the U.S. today, which is kind of interesting to me. But they would do this until the holes were actually several inches across. They would put discs made out of jade or shell in the holes. Men and women would also, and this I think is interesting, this is less common in the U.S. today, but there are some people who do this. They would file their teeth to points, and then they would inlay their teeth with jade. So that's I guess that's next. I also think it's interesting that the Maya people were very fond of baths. They liked to take baths, they liked to keep clean. And this is interesting because this was a practice in Europe at this same time that people were afraid of and scared of. I think if they had been less afraid of baths in Europe, they might have had an easier time with the bubonic plague. Maya people liked perfume. They wore it, men and women. They made perfume from flowers and herbs, much like perfume has been made over the centuries. And they carried mirrors. In fact, most men carried mirrors to, check their appearance, which I think is kind of funny, kind of interesting. Pardon me. Mayan social classes. We're on page 301 in your book now. Mayan social classes. So, several levels in Mayan social classes, and this is not going to surprise you, I don't think. You're going to hear this and you're going to say, well, that sounds awfully familiar. Similar to the Egyptians, similar to the Harappan civilization, similar to most civilizations throughout history. At the top, of course, was the ruler, the top social class. They believed they were descended from the gods, and these were, of course, the kings. The Mayan kings. They believed, because they were descended from the gods, that they should be obeyed unquestioningly, absolute authority. The kings claimed to speak to the gods on behalf of the people, and the problem with this, of course, is that power often goes to people's heads, and it was no different with the Mayan kings, and many of the Mayan kings took advantage of this absolute authority and really mistreated their people. Every city-state, because the Mayan Empire wasn't really one empire altogether, each city-state had a unique hieroglyph to represent it and to represent its kings. These hieroglyphs helped scholars to identify 33 different rulers of the city-state Tikal, and in fact, one of those rulers was actually a queen, at least one that we know of. There was a king of Tikal whose name was Jassau, and Tikal had been a very weak city-state, and then Jassau came to power and really built it up, became a very strong city-state under his leadership. In fact, you can actually read about him on page 301 in your book. Now, just below the kings in power were the priests. There were at least 4 social classes of priests. At least 4 social classes of priests. The highest ranking priests were in charge of all the other priests, and they were the ones that taught. And they taught things like writing and astronomy, mathematics, and of course religious studies. You had to learn about the gods and how to please them. Lower ranks of priests included priests who treated illnesses. I'm not going to go into this, but some of the ways they treated illnesses were pretty awful. Imagine going in for a broken nose and getting your foot cut off. There's some pretty crazy stuff that they did. Now, in the same social class as the priests were the nobles. In fact, all of the priests came from the nobility. The nobles were educated, and unlike some of the other cultures that we've studied about, the Mayans educated their men and their women in the nobility class. And the men in the nobility class had positions of importance in government. Lesser nobles included artists and architects and people in the trades and the scribes, engineers, those kinds of things. They didn't have the same high positions that the first class of nobles did, but they were high up enough in rank that they did no manual labor. No nobleman or noblewoman had to do any kind of manual labor. So they didn't do any farming, they didn't do any cleaning, they didn't do any of the stuff that would be considered manual labor. That kind of labor was left for the common people. These were the peasants, and this was the third level of the social classes, the peasants. These were hardworking people. That's not to say that other people didn't work hard, but this was the hard manual labor. Soldiers were in this class, as were day laborers. So the farmers, soldiers, laborers in this class. They were the ones that grew and harvested and processed the food. They grew cotton, they produced the fabric, they tended to the buildings, they constructed buildings, they fought in the army. At the very bottom of Mayan society were the slaves. Those were the very bottom. Now we're on 161 in your salmon. We're on section 5 on 161. Very bottom of society, slaves, and let's talk about that for a second. If you were in debt, if you owed a debt that you couldn't pay, or if you committed a crime, you would be considered a slave. You would become the property of another person. Slavery was worldwide. It's really interesting to me and kind of sad how truly recently it's been that slavery has been considered to be a bad thing. That's just really stunning to me that for 6,000 years of human history, people have owned slaves, and it's really amazing to me because as a Christian, I understand that every person is created in the image of God. If the Mayas conquered another people, they would take prisoners of war to be kept as slaves. If you were an important prisoner of war, you would be sacrificed to their gods. The Mayas did participate in sacrifice and in human sacrifice. Mayan dress, and this is where we're going to finish. We're going to go to 6-2. The men wore tunics, pretty simple cotton clothes actually, but the men would wear tunics and loincloths and short capes. Loincloths are just a piece of cloth that just covers around the hips. Women wore long blouses and wraparound skirts, or they wore dresses that were straight and plain. And they either went barefoot or they wore sandals that were made out of straw and rope. Men and women wore a lot of jewelry, a lot of jewelry. They would make the jewelry from all kinds of things: jade, shells, volcanic rock, animal teeth, animal bones. Wealthy people wore the same things as poorer people. It was just fancier, more ornamentation and feathers sewn into the fabric, stuff like that. And they wore sandals made out of deer skin. The kings wore these clothes, the fancier clothes, but they also wore jaguar skins and breastplates made out of jade. They would also have these headdresses made out of, that would have these plumes, feathers, that were 3 feet high. They came from a bird called the quetzal, which is a gorgeous rainforest bird down in Guatemala, and you can see some pictures on page, 302 in your book of these birds. Quetzal, by the way, is spelled Quetzal. You should look that up. It's a really interesting bird. Kings would also wear bracelets made out of jade on their wrists and their ankles, gold rings. Pretty interesting. The Mayan, this is really cool, on 303, the Mayans were very fond of their chocolate. And chocolate comes from this area, Central America. In fact, this is kind of something to think about, is that Europeans had never had chocolate. It didn't grow anywhere else. They had never had it until it was brought back from Central America by the conquistadors. The Mayans invented hot chocolate. Now, keep in mind, they didn't put sugar in it. It wasn't sweet. It was bitter chocolate, and they made it from the powdered cacao or cacao beans. I always pronounce that incorrectly. I need to look that up. It was so special to the Mayans that the cacao bean was incredibly valuable, and they used it as money. They used it as money. We are actually going to stop there. I'm going to divide that there. Tomorrow, I'm going to put out another video, and we're going to talk about the Mayan homes and daily life. We're going to talk about the Mayan religion and the Mayan ball game, and then the next video after that, we'll talk about the Aztecs and finish up this chapter. I hope that you have a great week, and I hope to hear from you soon.